Okay, so I just kind of looked back on that past video clip. Might be a little hard to see. Anyway, this is definitely a mix-up job in terms of changing it up and not just you seeing kind of me talk to the camera. Leaving or picking up where I left off in terms of anthropologists and when they begin to study. Remember, so the 1890s is really when anthropology gets in there. We've had about 85 years of contact, from missionary interaction to treaties being ripped up to gold miners. There has been a lot of activity in this area. And to go in as an anthropologist and say, this is how the people are, would be correct if we're doing ethnographic data at the time. However, change and cultural destruction have happened. And how much can we kind of look back and even talk to the elders in those communities and ask them to look back on their life to see how things were different maybe before contact, right? So let's say that we're talking to a grandparent who is maybe 75 years old. They have not lived in a world where there was no contact. So again, now we're getting into studying culture groups that have already changed. And my big question again, as I kind of read through anthropological work, is how much of this did change? When did it change? And would that change, was it inevitable? Would these groups have changed without kind of having this contact? What does that look like? And I think it's important to ask those questions constantly, right? Another important point for us is, yes, we have 1890s research, but really between 1920 and 1960, a lot of this culture is going to kind of change, adapt, assimilate, and it's not going to be studied by anthropologists very much during this time period. After the 1960s, your book's going to talk a lot about 1960s becoming a time when anthropology work becomes big again, because that's when the field really has a resurgence in the collective conscious of Americans, the need to know how people used to live, and maybe that the true history of humans, those kinds of things, those big questions start to be asked by the counterculture movement and actually a lot of academia at the time as well. Okay, so this is why we don't really get a lot of activity in the anthropological world in the Plateau region until after 1960 as well. Okay, political organization. This is, again, I could spend a whole semester just talking about politics, policy, and organizations of different groups, right? I've talked plenty about egalitarianism, but what I want to kind of focus on now is how we might actually see the transition in the transitioning groups from maybe purely egalitarian, where everybody has a voice, to the next stage where we still maybe say that women and men are equal in status, and then kind of move through that into a big man, big woman stature and chiefdom. Okay. Now, what's fascinating here is that your book and author are going to say that these groups, these semi-permanent villages, had a headman or a chief. Now, remember, this is an important distinction. Headmen were almost elected or put in place because of their prestige or social value. Okay. And it's usually an elderly individual, but it could also have been a male or a female. Now, when we get into chiefdoms, right, that's when we pass down our bloodline. That's when we pass down a scribe status. So sometimes these groups were headman groups. Really, I would call this not headmen, but big men. If they were permanent. If they were not permanent, then they were headmen. Just to confuse you a little bit more, right? Remember, headmen tend to be tribal leaders that then deal with issues and give their power back when that issue is solved. Big men, big woman, chief, okay, tend to be permanent leaders, right? And in this, they're kind of skipping over the big man section of things, or big woman, intermediary between achieved and ascribed status, right? Achieved is prestige. People want me in this role. It's how we vote for president, right? That's an achieved status. Ascribed status is like monarchy. You're born into it, okay? And again, so, and your book points out that sometimes chiefdoms were passed down bloodline. So that would be a chiefdom. If there is a chief, male or female, and then their offspring inherits the chiefdom, that is a chiefdom. Now, what's fascinating is this could be a smaller group of people, more the tribal size. Okay? And again, this is what I'm talking about with the gray area. It didn't, just because the size number didn't necessarily dictate the political structure, right? It correlates, but it does not dictate, okay? What's fascinating is your book talks, again, the author does some interesting things with verbiage. And I think it's because we have these binaries that we learn from and we're able to express, and maybe we lack terms for certain things, but we really need to think in that gray area zone. If the chief was a male, then his wife could a lot of times be a co-chief and seen as just as valuable, not just from women, but men as well, right? The other thing that that is also discussed is this idea of village council, where everybody has a voice. You can see here that this is self-government, right? This is a tie-over probably from the band level structure where everybody has a voice in part of the decision making. Okay. However, the chief is now a permanent structure. Okay. But the one key here is that in the Paleo-Indian time period back in the day, when these groups were mobile and moved around, they probably did not have a chief or a headman. Okay. So when they became stable or semi-permanent villages, okay, this is when they most likely adopted this idea of a chief or a headman. And you can see that the plateau region is a perfect example of that intermediary between these political structures of egalitarianism and moving into more hierarchy, status, prestige, and leadership. Okay. Inter-village council would be a combination of these village councils getting together, having interacting ceremonies, those kinds of things. Who's going to fish where? Those kinds of issues might be solved by this. Your book points out that these groups were mostly pacifist, and then it says that war did happen, and it says that slavery exists. Okay. Now, again, I have to ask, because this is how I was trained as an anthropologist, is did war happen before the horse came? Remember, prior to the horse coming, there was most likely, in all likelihood, zero private property. When the horse comes, individuals claim certain horses. It's like a pet. Okay? Now we have private property. Most likely, at least what it looks like in an archaeological record and kind of everything that I have read, is that slavery and war correlated with the horse coming up. Now, were there exceptions to that rule? I'm willing to admit to those. There probably were, because we're human and we have the whole gambit or spectrum of humanity here. However, anthropologists started to study in the 1890s after 85 years of contact. So did war happen because we helped to teach war? Because horse ownership created jealousy and power and prestige and wealth? And did that then create a system of slavery? If we own a horse, that's an ownership. Slavery is as well, owning other people, property. We could have traded those things, right? And again, were these things taught to us by the people that came in? Okay? Lewis and Clark, coming in from the East. Slavery still existed in America during this time period. Okay? Most of the contact time period of this 85 years, slavery was existing, or even civil war. Did we teach these concepts? Okay? Or did they already exist? Now again, here's my other follow-up to that. If these examples of war and slavery are coming out of missionary descriptions, where earliest people there kind of describing what's going on, how do we know that they were interpreting what they saw correctly? Okay? If they saw individuals from another group basically coming in and maybe not fitting in with the other group and being treated maybe not as up to status, right, as everybody else, was this just an example of an individual leaving his band or tribe and joining another one and having to fit in and what that process looked like? So what it is a lot of these documentations and recordings have a bias, right? And again, I can't go back and say, well, they're biased, therefore they're not accurate. What I can do is analyze them for potential bias, okay? And again, a lot of this is coming out of this time period, right? Missionaries with a Christian bias or mindset are going to say certain things about groups of people. This would be one of the reasons why the people probably didn't claim that they ate grasshoppers or bugs, even though they're the easiest protein source to kind of maintain, dry, keep for the winter, create protein flour, whatever you want to do with them. They probably realized that this is not how you interact with a group that's coming in that seems more advanced and civilized. Okay? So again, throughout this week and throughout the rest of the class, realize this idea of pacifism and then war and slavery, right? And a lot of times your book says these groups are pacifist, but war could have happened, and war was prestigious in this way. That sounds like to me that the holdover from the past was pacifism, that war was then created through maybe the horse or other groups coming in, like Westerners, teaching them war, and then was created as this valuable, prestigious thing. Okay, at least in terms of my analysis and my experience in Native Americans and indigenous groups of people, this tends to be the story. Okay. However, again, I am not an absolutist. Generalizing does tend to happen in these fields, but staying in that gray area is key, right? Analysis is the goal. Okay. All right. So social organization. These people in the plateau would really organize themselves. The main social unit, again, is extended family. Shocker, right? The other groups that we have talked about, it's all about the family, the nuclear family, and the extended family. Leaders were the eldest members of society. Okay. And again, this is also true in most indigenous band level groups, tribal level groups, until really you get into a chiefdom, which is ascribed, where a dad may die and now the young son is the chief, correct? Now we're getting more into maybe youth leadership. Prior to that, elders and what we would call a gerontocracy, where elders hold the power, have the power. The reason why they have it is because they have the most knowledge of which plants to eat, which plants not to, how to deal with certain situations, those kinds of things, right? So elders having the power is part of this level of social organization as well, right? Our current day and age, it's kind of a mix. But I can tell you that we're moving away from our gerontocracy, which is we start to distrust, maybe not distrust, but definitely not hold our elders' stories and knowledge as valuable as we used to. Now we value youth a bit more. Okay, I mean, this is apparent in just kind of my grandparents' generation in terms of retirement communities, nursing homes, those kinds of things, right? Prior to my grandparents' generation, people didn't do that. They took care of their elderly because they were seen as valuable in that way, and a sense of duty and responsibility. We've shifted that to a neontocracy where even my grandparents didn't want to burden their kids with taking care of them when they aged, which is a total switch to what we call a neontocracy, right? Kinship was bilateral, right? So individuals in the same generation were referred to as the same. So my aunt and uncle on both mom and dad's side would probably also be called mom and dad. This is how the book reads, and I think that this is what they're referring to. The Hawaiian kinship structure is the same. Aunts and uncles would be mom and dad, which would give you more access to trusted family members. Okay, so if my aunts and uncles were referred to as mom and dad, I wouldn't necessarily treat them differently, correct? You would have more people to basically go to if you had kind of questions about life growing up, those kinds of things, okay? Division of labor. There was division of labor, right? The idea of men being political leaders. Then your book says men are political leaders, but then in the last section of political organization, it talked about women possibly being chiefs or headmen or co-chiefs. So again, a little binary issue there. And then ultimately, women were kind of more in charge of processing, cooking, domestic, so-called domestic work. Men would be the hunters, kind of the warriors and those kinds of things, right? And again, did this get messed up with the advent of horse, slavery, those issues, contact? Did they get mixed up? Remember, if the missionaries come in and say, I want to talk to the chief, they're now naming somebody who is usually male in that tribe or group as a chief, and then is going to be recognized as a chief, okay? All boys and girls go on a vision quest, and this picture is kind of an illustration of what a vision quest might look like. This is around puberty. It's a rite of passage, and important to these groups, right? It is an individual thing, but it's basically finding your place in the universe. It's kind of interesting. We still kind of do this in America in a way, which is go find yourself, right? And you're supposed to go do this. The vision quest is similar, but to community.